Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today's topic of discussion is relative deprivation theory from the course Social Movement. This video lecture was recorded by me at home during the national lockdown period for COVID-19 pandemic using minimal technical resources. Technical errors, if any, are unintentional and may please be ignored. Hello friends, my name is Imtiaz Ahmed Ansari and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Jamia Millia Islamia. This project has been sponsored by DTH Swayam Prabha, Ministry of Human Resource Development, New Delhi. The theory of relative deprivation was one of the most popular theories to explain collective behavior and social movement in the 1950s and 1960s. But the history of the term is quite old. Basically, the concept of relative deprivation in the study of social movement is as old as the subject sociology itself. For example, both Karl Marx as well as the French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville, they developed some early formulation, some early conception related to the theory of relative deprivation. For example, if you see the writings of Karl Marx, especially his publication Wage, Labor and Capital, where he mentions that a house may be large or small as long as the surrounding houses are equally small. It satisfies all social demand for its dwelling. But let a palace arise beside the little house and it shrinks from a little house to a hut. Our desires and pleasures spring from society. We measure them, therefore, by society and not by the objects which serve for their satisfaction. Because they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. This passage from Marx's writing basically gives an indication that Marx was basically emphasizing on the concept of relative deprivation in his own style. So many relative deprivation theorists have used this conception of Karl Marx in further developing this relative deprivation theory, relative concept of relative deprivation to explain the phenomenon of social movement. Especially these relative deprivation theories, they focus on Marx's immiseration thesis to emphasize the importance of relative deprivation. Now, Marx in his various writings have focused on the relative material inequality between classes, between the capitalist and the working class. And he predicted that workers would revolt in the face of improving living standards if they perceived capitalist living standards to be rising even faster. So Marx's immiseration thesis basically is the thesis that which predicts that although the living conditions of the working class may improve in the capitalist society, but the gap between the capitalist and the working class will keep on increasing. So this increasing gap between the capitalist and the working class will develop a feeling of relative deprivation among the working class, among the proletariat. Although their living condition and their lifestyle standard of life may improve as the capitalist society develops. So this is known as Marx immiseration thesis or Marx pauperization thesis, in which workers feel relatively deprived in comparison to the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. Other thinker in whose writings some early conceptions of relative deprivation can be located is the French political theorist and as well as the aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat and political theorist He's famous for his work, especially Democracy in America and The Old Regime and the Revolution. Now, in both these books, Tocqueville analyzed the improved living standards and social conditions of individuals as well as their relationship to the market and state in Western societies. And he observed that relative deprivation alone was insufficient for revolution. So what was needed along with relative deprivation? That it is the rising expectation. So along with relative deprivation, the feeling of rising expectation is necessary for any revolution to emerge. An expectation that revolution would improve the situation. So Tocqueville explained that revolution tend to occur when states were basically becoming more relaxing, or they're providing more freedom to the people rather than when they are more oppressive. So as and when states start relaxing their control or start relaxing their oppression over the common people, it will lead to some kind of rising expectations among the masses, and these rising expectations along with the feeling of relative deprivation will provide the background in which revolution is likely to emerge. So Tocqueville also mentioned that revolutions occur when states are relaxing, not increasing oppression. And he basically compared the French, the France, he made a comparative study of France and Germany in order to in order to explain his conceptualization of relative deprivation. So Tocqueville asked the question that why did revolution occurred in France, which was basically more progressive than the traditional Germany. So whereas feudalism was breaking down in France and it was more progressive than Germany, but it was France where revolution happened and not in Germany. So in order to find this answer to this question, Tocqueville answer was that as bad as their condition was, the German peasants had known nothing but feudal servitude, and so they could imagine little else and had no basis for feeling deprived. Whereas on the other hand, the French peasants, by contrast, had seen improvement in their lives that made them eager for more change. So, for Tocqueville, the increasing freedom and prosperity of people in France was the main reason why revolution was one of the reasons why revolution happened in France and not in Germany. So, for Tocqueville, increasing freedom and prosperity did not satisfy people as much as it sparked their desire for an even better life. So, Tocqueville used the argument of relative deprivation as well as rising expectations to explain that the strongholds of French Revolution were precisely those reasons, those areas in which the greatest improvements in the standard of life had occurred, and observed that any relaxation of an oppressive regime basically creates some kind of expectation in the population, which further demands, which further wants more reforms or more freedom for the common people. So Tocqueville's insight has been used to explain some of the patterns of rioting and urban race riots in America in the 1960s. So this was basically the one of the earliest conceptualization of Alexis de Tocqueville along with Karl Marx. In this list of early theorists who have worked on the concept of relative deprivation, we can also add the name of American socialist Viktor Sorokin. And as you can see from this passage from his book, Sociology of Revolution, where he mentioned that poverty or wealth of a man is measured not by what he has at present, but by what he used to have before or what others have. So in this passage of Sorokin also reflects that poverty or the lack of poverty or wealth is basically always measured in a relative sense. So we use some kind of reference group, some kind of reference individuals to measure our level of poverty or to measure our relative wealth. So that reference person or reference group can be the individual himself when they try to measure their present condition with the past condition, or it can be someone else, some external individual or some external group. So these are some of the earliest thinkers: Karl Marx, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Pitrin Sorokin, who tried to make an early conceptualization of the concept of relative deprivation. Now, after these early formulations, the second, or we can say the most important research in this in the field of relative deprivation took place in the 1930s and 1940s. So, beginning in the 1960s, a number of social movement scholars used the concept of relative deprivation in both theoretical and empirical work. This focus on relative deprivation, using relative deprivation to explain social movement, peaked late in the 1960s, in which numerous published studies tried to link the urban civil disturbances in America to various objective and subjective deprivations. So this link between relative deprivation and social movement is grounded in long-standing principles of social psychology, especially the frustration aggression model. So the conceptualization of relative deprivation, which started taking shape in 1930s and 1940s, was basically more inclined towards social psychology rather than sociology, and especially it was grounded in the psychological theory or social psychology theory of frustration aggression model. Later on in the 1950s and 1960s, many theorists have employed this frustration aggression model to explain the linkage between relative deprivation and the occurrence of civil riots and revolution or political violence. So just let us try to understand what this frustration aggression model, which became the foundation on which the modern conception of relative deprivation was made possible or became possible. So this frustration aggression model says that every individual strives to satisfy their needs, goals, and ambitions, but there is always chances of failure. So according to frustration aggression model, we all experience irritation and anger at some point in our life, and some may feel, for example, some may feel frustration if he or she is not able to attend a music concert of their choice, whereas some may feel frustrated because he is not earning money matching his qualification. So there are different reasons, or there can be different situations in which feeling of annoyance and feeling of anger and frustration may emerge. So the frustration of our desires and goals occasionally leads to anger, but it does not mean that all frustrations lead to anger. So it must be remembered that both frustration and anger are the two most common facts of our life. They may sometimes lead us to harm or to hurt someone else. So these feelings of frustration and aggression are so powerful that in many situations, in many conditions, it is possible that it may compel people to harm or to hurt others, because that is the only way by which they can relieve their anxiety, by which they can feel comfortable. So this theory says that although everyone tries to satisfy their different needs, goals, and ambitions, but failures are likely to happen. And according to this theory, the three most common reasons for failure is ambition, when the ambition exceeds abilities, or when we wrongly perceive our possibilities, and the third is external barrier. So The three most common reasons of failure is high ambition, wrong perception, and external barrier. So these are the three major factors of failure. So so the emergence of frustration and the consequent aggressive behavior in the individuals. So according to this frustration aggression model, high ambition and the wrong perception of possibilities and external constraints and barriers, they all may lead to the feeling of frustration in individuals. So high ambition means that we have set our goals, we have set our ambitions at such a point which is beyond our capacity, which is beyond our capabilities. So which we are unlikely to achieve, keeping in mind or keeping in the according to the current capabilities or according to our skills and capacities. So that may lead to failure. Second factor of failure is wrong perception. When we wrongly perceive that we are able to do something, but or something is in our control, achievable, but that is beyond our capacity. So wrong perception is again a factor for failure. And the third may be the external barriers. So barriers which are beyond our control, beyond our capacity. So some structural conditions, although you have the capacity, although the person may be capable, but the structural condition or the structure of society does not allow them to realize their goals or to satisfy their needs. So all these three conditions result into failure and ultimately it result into some kind of feeling of frustration. Now, in this frustration aggression model, the most important name or the most important scholar identified with frustration aggression theory is John Dollard. So John Dollard and his associates, they conducted a research in the 1939 to be more precise, which was published as frustration and aggression. Now this study assumes that aggression is always a consequence of frustration. So more specifically, Dollard's and associate proposition says that the occurrence of aggressive behavior always presupposes the existence of frustration, and contrariwise, that the existence of frustration always leads to some form of aggression. So both these processes of frustration and aggression are intimately connected, simply because when the aggressive behavior, people become aggressive when they feel some kind of frustration, and whenever people are frustrated, it is likely that they will behave in a more aggressive manner. So this was one of the earliest conception of frustration aggression model, or we can say the most complete theory of frustration aggression model, which was developed by John Dollard and his associates in 1939, in which they argued that there is a direct positive relationship between instigation to aggression and the amount of frustration. So the formulation developed by Dollard and his associates generated considerable laboratory experimentation and empirical research in 1940s and 1950s. However, later on, the formulations developed by Dollard and associates failed, and because they failed to stood up to the new empirical results or the new empirical researches conducted in the field of social psychology as well as sociology. But there is no doubt that this frustration aggression model provided a platform, provided a background on which the modern concept of relative deprivation in the 1940s and 1950s took shape or emerged. Whenever the concept of relative deprivation comes into discussion, the most famous name or the most prominent name which comes to our mind is Samuel Stauffer, the American social psychologist. So this modern concept of relative deprivation gained status and importance through its use as an analytical and interpretive tool in the study conducted by Samuel Stauffer and his associates, and that study is The American Soldier, which was published in 1949. So Samuel Stauffer and his associates at the research division of the information branch of the U.S. Army, they were the first who used the term relative deprivation in their classic study, American Soldier. So it is Samuel Stauffer and his associates who basically, for the first time, used the term relative deprivation in their studies, in their study published in 1949, called the American Soldier. So he made a comparison between the military police and the uh, air corpsmen. So Stauffer devised this concept of relative deprivation as a post hoc explanation. Now let me explain what is post hoc explanation or post hoc reasoning. Post hoc explanation is that where it is believed that because one event follows another, the first must have been the cause of the second. So for example, uh, if A is followed by B, it is believed that B happened because of the existence of A, or A is the cause of B. This is called post hoc reasoning or post hoc explanation. But in some cases, this post hoc explanation may be true, but it is not necessary that in each and every case it will be true or it will be a valid reasoning or explanation. So from the research conducted by Stauffer and his associates, uh, two uh, examples uh, became especially famous or popular. So Stauffer and his colleagues, they found that the military police were more satisfied than air corpsmen. Military police compared their promotions with other military police, not with the air corpsmen, whom they rarely encountered. Similarly, the black soldiers in the southern camp, they compared their conditions with the black civilians in the south, not with the black soldiers in the north, with whom they had no contact. So Stauffer concluded that satisfaction is relative, and it is always made in comparison to the available reference group or available comparative category. So Stauffer found that air corpsmen were in fact considerably more frustrated over promotions than the military police. And air corpsmen, although the system of promotion of air corpsmen was highly rapid and it was more open system promotion, which basically led them to adopt extremely high aspirations. So most of the air corpsmen, uh, they expected such swift elevation that even the generous promotions provided by the system for their services left them relatively dissatisfied. By contrast, the morale was reasonably high among the military police because they did not expect rapid promotions and were relatively content with whatever few advances, whatever few promotions they were able to achieve in their service. So it is not the absolute level of attainment that made for poor morale so much as relative deprivation, but it is the discrepancy between between what one anticipates and what one attains. So here it can be seen that Stauffer is developing a completely uh, comparative, or what is called the concept of relative deprivation, where he says that it is not the absolute level of attainment that made for poor morale among the air corpsmen, and it is a feeling of relative deprivation where there is a discrepancy between anticipation and attainment. So whenever there is a gap between what we anticipate and what we attain or what we achieve, there is always a feeling of relative deprivation. So this was basically the work of Samuel Stauffer and associates, published in the book American Soldier 1949, where for the first time this term relative deprivation was used and developed as a kind of a conceptual tool to study feeling of deprivation or to study feeling of satisfaction. Now, with this background, the early formulations of relative deprivation, it is better to first have a understanding of what is the meaning of absolute and relative deprivation. So deprivation can be both absolute as well as relative. So relative deprivation or the deprivation can be measured in both absolute terms as well as relative terms. The most common field in which these two terms are used is when we measure or the measurement of poverty. So poverty can be measured in absolute terms as well as it can be measured in relative terms. So we use the concepts or we use the terms absolute poverty and relative poverty. So absolute poverty is when household income is below a certain level, when a certain threshold level, which makes it impossible for the person or family to meet their basic needs, including food or education or safe drinking water or healthcare or etc. So absolute poverty compares households based on a set income level, and this level may vary from country to country depending on its overall economic conditions. So the absolute poverty of societies of states may vary because uh, their economic conditions is not the same, or because of different economic conditions, different level of prosperity and poverty, their level of their measurement of absolute poverty is likely to vary. Whereas relative deprivation or relative poverty happens because the people falling under this category are not living in total poverty, but they are not enjoying the same standard of life as others in the country. So if someone is not having a TV or the latest mobile or internet connections or a safe home, uh, or a safe home or even education, the feeling of relative deprivation may emerge. Or so relative deprivation or relative poverty can also be permanent, meaning that certain families have absolutely no chance of enjoying the same standard of living as other people in the same society, where the other have the access to these valued goods. So although it is possible to end absolute poverty in a society, it is difficult or rather impossible to end relative deprivation, because some level of inequality, some system of differences and unequal distribution of resources will always be present in every society. And when these differences become the reasons, or these differences are used in a comparative sense in making a relative comparison with someone else in society. So this feeling of relative deprivation is more likely to survive in society, because some feeling of or some system of inequality is always present in each and every society. So this was the idea of absolute deprivation and relative deprivation, and this concept is most commonly used in measuring poverty, absolute poverty and relative poverty. Now, this concept of relative deprivation says that it is not always necessary that frustrated members are not the worst off in an objective sense. So, those members of a society who feel most frustrated by social and economic conditions are not necessarily the worst off in an objective sense. So, some people may not be as poor as someone else, those living at the bottom of the hierarchy, but these people who are much above the social ladder or social hierarchy, they may feel some condition of relative deprivation. So that is why it is mentioned that frustrated members are not always the worst of, or always the most poorest or the most marginalized sections of the society. So objectively, in objective sense, in absolute terms, they may be the poorest, but it is not necessary that they are also the frustrated or feeling a condition of relative deprivation. So people may feel unjustly treated or inadequately compensated when they compare themselves to some standard of reference. Because deprivation is relative, it is often true that those who are the most deprived, in an objective sense, are not the ones most likely to experience deprivations. So this is basically the essential concept or condition of the theory of relative deprivation, that it is not always necessary that the poorest sections or the worst off sections of society, they may feel relatively deprived and frustrated, but it is possible that those who feel relatively deprived and frustrated, they may be much better in terms of their objective conditions, or in terms of their absolute in terms of their absolute deprivation or absolute poverty. So this feeling of relative deprivation is most likely to emerge whenever there is a gap between what one has and what one expects, anticipation and attainment. So we are expecting something, but we are getting or we are achieving something else. So whenever there is a gap between what we expect and what we actually have, what we actually possess, this may lead to the feeling of relative deprivation. Another component of relative deprivation is that in this deprived in comparison to relative reference individuals and groups. So people, whereas in absolute terms it is whereas absolute deprivation is measured in objective terms, relative deprivation is always measured in a subjective sense or in a relative sense. So in the basic case, relative deprivation or gratification occurs whenever an individual or a group of individuals, they feel deprived or gratified in comparison to some other reference individuals and groups. So for relative deprivation to exist, there must be some kind of comparison where the individual or the group, they compare themselves with some other reference groups and individuals. Now this comparison with a non-deprived referent individual or group leads to high expectations, and when these high expectations remain unfulfilled or unachieved, it may lead in turn to severe feeling of deprivation and unfairness. So whenever an individual compares his or her condition, or the group compares their condition with some other external group, and when they feel that the other group is non-deprived, or the other group is much better from in terms of their social condition and standard of life, this feeling of relative deprivation is likely to emerge. Now that reference individual or group may be, that reference may be one's past or the other individuals and groups in society. So the reference point can be the individual's past condition as well as some external individuals and groups. So for example, if a person A makes a comparison with his condition in 2020, in 2020, with his condition say in 2010, and he comes to realize that his condition in 2010 was much better than what he has in 2020, he may feel a sense of relative deprivation. So reference may be one's past, or it may be the other individuals and groups in the same time period, the same time and place. So both one's past condition as well as some external individuals and groups can be taken as a reference point, which may lead to some feeling of relative deprivation. This theory says that social movements arise among people who feel deprived. So theory of relative deprivation argues that social movements or social movement or those social movement oriented towards change, they arise among people who feel deprived or relatively deprived. So people who feel that they lack enough income, enough money, safe working condition, or some fundamental political rights or fundamental human dignity, they may organize a social movement to bring about a more just and a more equal society. So relative deprivation theory suggests that people who feel they are being deprived of something which is considered essential in their society, and that essential commodity component can be the money, some kind of social and political rights, or status. When they feel that they are being deprived in these terms, they will organize or join social movements uh, directed to obtaining the things of which they feel they have been deprived. So this feeling or this concept of relative deprivation has been used, has been cited as one of the reasons, one of the major factors of the civil riots which took place in America in the 1960s, which was basically rooted in Black Americans' struggle to gain social and legal equality with the white American. So, a relatively deprived person is dissatisfied because he or she feels downtrodden and neglected relative to some other appropriate reference individual or groups. For example, another example can be that a white collar professional who lives in a rented accommodation, although he may not be at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, he may nevertheless feel deprived when he compares or in comparison to some corporate manager and professionals who live in lavish homes in some exclusive locality. So this feeling of relative deprivation emerges when we make a comparison of our condition either with our own past condition or with some other external individuals or groups in the same time at the same time in the contemporary period. Now, two important other elements are involved in this concept of relative deprivation. This is the right to goal and the feeling that it must be achieved by any means. So, in addition to the feeling of relative deprivation, these two elements must be present before discontent or frustration transform into social movement. So, people must feel that they have a right to their goals, that they deserve better than what they have. At the same time, the disadvantaged group must perceive that its goals cannot be attained through conventional means, through conventional process. So this belief may or may not be correct. So, but whatever the case, the group will not mobilize into a social movement unless there is a shared perception that members can end their relative deprivation only through collective action. So, for movement to emerge, these two conditions, these two elements are important, that the person must feel that it is their right to achieve their goal, and the goal, if it is not possible to be achieved by some conventional means, any kind of non-conventional means is justified, or the achievement of goals is justified by any available means. So social movement is likely to be the result, or social movement is likely to emerge in these conditions. Now, with this brief historical background of the concept of relative deprivation, now in the next few minutes, I will discuss some of the prominent theorists who have made significant contribution in advancing the concept of relative deprivation. And in this list, one of the thinkers is James A. Davis, who has who have basically developed this concept of relative deprivation in 1959 when he published his article uh, titled "A Formal Interpretation of the Theory of Relative Deprivation." So after Samuel Stauffer developed this concept of relative deprivation, different models of relative deprivation were developed based on the earlier formulations of frustration aggression model developed by John Dollard and Associates, and Stauffer's and Associate conceptualization of relative deprivation. So now I'm going to discuss some of the major theoretical formulations of relative deprivation which emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, which were used for explaining and understanding social movements. So James A. Davis was the first theorist, we can say one of the first earliest theorists to develop a formal theory of relative deprivation, or he was the one of the earliest to develop a more formalistic or formal theory of relative deprivation. So according to Davis, an individual who lacks some desired good or opportunity, which he calls as X. So X is any desired good or opportunity. So when an individual who lacks some desired good or opportunity, X, experiences a sense of injustice uh, whenever perceives that similar other possess X. So, uh, what is evident in Davis theory is the notion that the individual who perceives that similar others possess X feels entitled to possess X himself. So, the necessary determinants of felt deprivation, according to Davis, are that the individual who lacks X may be any kind of a desired good or opportunity. So when an individual who lacks X perceive that the other person or someone else has that good or opportunity X, at the same time the person wants to possess X, the desired good opportunity, and he also feels that he is entitled to possess or to have that desired good or opportunity. So when any of these elements is lacking or not present, deprivation does not arise. So according to Davis, for deprivation to arise, three conditions are important. What are these? Whenever deprivation is simply the lack of desired goods, so there must be a feeling that there must be a feeling in someone that he lacks some desired good or opportunity. But at the same time, he also realizes, he also perceives that some other person, some other similarly placed person, individual, has that desired good or object or opportunity. And he believes that he wants to possess or he wants to have access to that desired good or opportunity X, and he also believes that he is entitled to X. So for the feeling of deprivation to emerge, all these three conditions are necessary in an individual to develop. If any of these elements is lacking, according to Davis, deprivation does not emerge, deprivation does not occur. So this was one of the earliest formulations of relative deprivation developed by James A. Davis. Now, the second theorist who further refined this concept of relative deprivation is Walter Garrison Runciman. Now, Runciman published his book titled Relative Deprivation and Social Justice in 1966, in which he focused on class, status, and power hierarchies in Britain, and in which Runciman tried to answer the question that when inequality is translated into grievances, and why so often it is not. So basically, in his research, he wanted to find the answer to the question that when inequality is translated into grievance, and why in some situation inequality leads to grievance, but in some other situation that feeling of inequality does not transform or translate it into feeling of grievance. So along with this, the three factors of deprivation developed by James Davis, Runciman adds one more factor to that these three elements. And what is that fourth factor? That individuals must think feasible to obtain X. So to define it in a more formal sense, so according to Runciman, suppose A is the individual, so A is relatively deprived of X, the desired good opportunity, when he does not have X, the first condition of Davis. Second, when A sees that some other person or persons uh, basically they have X or they have that desired good or opportunity. Third, A believes that he wants X, and the fourth dimension added by Runciman was that A sees it as feasible that he should have X. So this feeling, this fourth factor, basically makes this Runciman, this concept of relative deprivation developed by Runciman, relatively much better, or a kind of a much advanced, complete, as compared to Davis' formulation of relative deprivation. So Runciman can be this transformation of unrealistic hopes into reality-based aspiration is also necessary for deprivation to emerge. Now, Runciman made an important contribution in the theory of relative deprivation when he differentiated or identified two different forms of relative deprivation, which he called as egoistic and fraternalist deprivation. So, in order to understand what are these two different conceptions of deprivation, if you look at this statement of Runciman, where he says, did he want to rise out of his membership group or with it? Now, this sentence basically provides a clue to the meaning of what is egoistic deprivation and what is fraternalist deprivation. So, did he want to rise out of his membership group or with it? So, if the first case, rise out of his membership group, then he was dissatisfied with his position as a member of what he saw as his group. Now, if the second, or with it, then he was dissatisfied with the position of what he saw as his group relative to other groups in the larger system. So, Runciman argues that fraternalist deprivation, basically it is a fraternalist deprivation which generates agitation for or against structural change. So, out of these two, egoistic and fraternalist deprivation, according to Runciman, it is a fraternalist deprivation, a group comparison, a feeling of deprivation at the group level, which basically responsible or which generates a feeling of agitation for some structural change or for social movement. So, according to fraternalist deprivation generates agitation. It may be agitation for structural change, or it may be agitation against any kind of structural change. So, according to Runciman, the key factor promoting in fraternalist deprivation is lateral solidarity, which is basically a sense of kinship with other members of one's group. So, in fraternalist deprivation, the reference group theory becomes more useful, particularly the distinction between comparative and normative functions of reference group. So, according to Runciman, whereas any form of relative deprivation represents comparative influence of reference group, the lateral solidarity, which channels deprivation into fraternalist deprivation, forms may represent the normative influence of reference group. For example, when norms of working class solidarity channelizes into grievances into fraternalist deprivation. So this egoistic and fraternalist, out of these two forms of deprivation, egoistic and fraternalist deprivation, it is a fraternalist deprivation, deprivation at the group level when they make group comparison, which generates feeling of agitation for bringing some kind of structural change in the society. Now, the next theorist who has further defined this concept of relative deprivation is Robert Ted Gurr. When he published his book Why Men Rebel in 1970. So, in this book, Ted Robert Gurr adopts macro level measures and ignores the social psychological dimensions of relative deprivation. So, in this book, Gurr basically ignores the social psychological work on the theme of relative deprivation, and he ignores the fact that relative deprivation is a phenomenon of individuals and it is not of societies. So, Gurr employed gross macro level measures of relative deprivation at the economic and political, for example, economic and political indices of whole societies. So, Ted Gurr's model of relative deprivation was more macro, as he tried to compare economic and political indexes or economic and political condition of the entire society, and it is not something which is rooted in social psychology or focusing more on the individual level. So, Gurr's work is a macro level study that which does not involve the micro level approach adopted by Samuel Stoffel and in his associates in developing the early conception of relative deprivation when they in 1949. So, according to Ted Robert Guru defines relative deprivation as actors' perception of discrepancy between their value expectations and their value capabilities. Now, these are the two terms which need to be further elaborated or which need to be uh, kept in mind while discussing Robert Goore's explanation, conceptualization of relative deprivation. So, relative deprivation, as defined by Goore's, is actors' perception of discrepancy between their value expectation and their value capabilities. So, these two concepts, value expectation and value capabilities, are the central concept in this definition of relative deprivation. What are these two? What is value expectation and value capability? So value expectations are those goods and opportunities that the individual wants and to which he feels that he is entitled based on comparison with similar others, including his own position at some previous point of time. So value expectation is basically uh, are those goods and opportunities which the individual wants. He wants to possess, he wants to have access to these goods and opportunity. And not only he wants, but he believes that he is entitled to these goods and opportunity. And this feeling of entitlement emerges based on his comparison with someone else in the society, some other external individual, or with his own comparison at some other point of time. That is called value expectation. Whereas value capabilities are those goods and opportunities that the individual possesses or thinks that he can possess. So value expectation is basically those goods and opportunity which the individual wants to have, wants to possess, and which he feels that he is entitled to possess these goods and opportunity. Whereas value capabilities are those goods and opportunity that the individual actually possess, or thinks that he can possess at some point in time. So, Gore mentions that the potential for collective violence varies strongly with the intensity and scope of relative deprivation among members of a collectivity. So, if the feeling of relative deprivation is high, is more intense, according to Gore, Trade Robert Gore, the potential for collective violence is likely to emerge, or collective violence is likely to be the result of this feeling of relative deprivation among a group or among the members of a social group. Gore also identified that there are three different patterns of discrepancy between value expectation and value capabilities. So there is a disequilibrium between what a person believes that he is entitled to have certain goods and opportunity, value expectation, and what he thinks that he actually possesses. What are the actual goods and opportunity in possession of that individual? So there are three different forms of discrepancy or disequilibrium which may emerge between these two factors, these two components of deprivation: value expectation and value capabilities. What are these three different forms of discrepancy? The first is detrimental deprivation, second is aspirational deprivation, and the third is progressive deprivation. So let us try to understand one by one what are these three different forms of discrepancy between value expectation and value capabilities. So first one is decremental deprivation. So in decremental deprivation, a group's value expectations remain relatively constant, but value capabilities are perceived to decline. So, when this feeling of decremental deprivation emerges, the the group's value expectations, that what he is entitled to, what he wants, that remains constant, but value capabilities start declining, or it is perceived to be declining. For example, now the example of this decremental deprivation may include for the effects of progressive taxation on the wealthy and of the progressive taxation on the poor, the loss of political influence by elites and oppositional groups newly barred from political activity, and the decline in status and influence felt by middle class groups as the status of working class groups increases. So all these three examples basically reflect a condition or a feeling of decremental deprivation. So in decremental deprivation, the value expectations of the members of a group, it remains constant. What they want, that remains constant. There is no increase or decrease in their expectation, but the capacity or the capability, value capabilities, what they actually possess, that starts declining. So that is, and this decremental deprivation is possible in many, in different cases. As I just discussed, only three examples of decremental deprivation. So, for example, uh, the middle class, the feeling, the middle class group may feel some decremental deprivation when their status remains constant, but the status of the working class group starts improving. So that may lead to the feeling of decremental deprivation in the members of the middle class group. Second discrepancy identified by Robert Gore is aspirational deprivation. So aspirational deprivation, in which the value capabilities remain relatively static while expectations increase or intensify. So what we possess or what we have, whatever goods or opportunity we have, a person has, that remains constant. But his value expectation start increasing. He started feeling that he must possess more goods and he must possess more valuable opportunities. So whenever these situations arise, the individual or the group may feel aspirational deprivation. So aspirational deprivation is characterized by an increase in men's value expectations without a concomitant change in value potential or value position. So those who experience aspirational relative deprivation, they do not anticipate or experience significant loss of what they have, but they are angered because they feel they have no means for attaining new or intensified expectations. So an increase in value expectations may reflect demand for a greater amount of value already held in some degree. For example, more material goods and a greater degree of political order and injustice. So it may also be a demand for new values which was never previously held, such as political participation for colonial peoples and personal equality of members of lower class and caste groups. So simply, aspirational deprivation results when our value capabilities remains constant, but our value expectations, when we start feeling that we are entitled for something more or much privileged goods and opportunities in society. So this feeling of aspirational deprivation is likely to result. The third discrepancy between value expectation and value capabilities is progressive deprivation, in which there is a substantial and simultaneous increase uh, in value expectation and decrease in capabilities. So this progressive deprivation, according to Robert Gore, can be regarded as a special case of aspirational relative deprivation. So progressive deprivation, in one sense, is a kind of special form of aspirational deprivation in which there is a there is a continuous improvement in people's value positions, which generates expectations about continued improvement. So whenever there is an improvement or whenever there is a enhancement in the value expectations of members of a group, they feel that these expectations or these value expectations must continue with the same pace or with the same speed. But when these value capabilities stabilize or decline after a period of improvement, progressive relative deprivation is the result. For example, economic depression in a growing economy can result into feeling of progressive deprivation. So whenever there is a continuous increase in value expectations, and when people start feeling that these value expectations must keep on increasing, but because of certain other factors or because some other conditions, when these capabilities stabilize or become constant, people may feel, although they are not, there is no decline in value expectation, but that value expectation is not increasing with the same pace. So this progressive deprivation can be the outcome of these conditions. So according to Robert Gore, all these three patterns of deprivation are basically causal or predisposing factors of political violence. So these three forms of discrepancy, decremental, aspirational, and progressive deprivation, they can be the factors or predisposing factors for political violence in society. Now, the other important theorist who has developed this concept of relative deprivation is Denton E. Morrison, where Morrison says that, according to Morrison, relative deprivation is feeling that one is not receiving fair share of available resources. So, according to Morrison, the basic notion is that the feelings of deprivation or discontent over one's situation, it depends on what one wants to have. That is, deprivation occurs in relation to desired points of reference, most often the reference group, rather than in relation to how little one has. So, according to Morrison, social movements are thought to emerge and flourish when groups of persons experience relative deprivation. So, according to Morrison, deprivation is simply a feeling that someone or he or she is not, or the entire group is not receiving what is due to them or what is their fair share of available resources. And this feeling of relative deprivation is the basic reason for the emergence of social movement when this feeling becomes at the group level or the entire group experiences relative deprivation. So, according to Morrison, relative deprivation is the crucial factor or explanatory variable in explaining a social movement, because it leads to a deliberate and voluntary effort to organize individuals in order to achieve some kind of or in order to make certain changes in the social arrangement. Now, Morrison, in order to understand Morrison's concept of relative deprivation, it is important to understand what he terms legitimate expectations and blocked expectations. So, according to Morrison, discontent and feeling of deprivation in order to emerge, discontent, the feel in for discontent to emerge from relative deprivation, it is necessary that the desires involved must become legitimate expectations. So our desires must appear to us, or the desires of an individual must appear to him as legitimate expectations. At the same time, these legitimate expectations appears to that person as blocked. So, for discontent to arise from the feeling of relative deprivation, which may become the reason for social movement, the desires of a person must appear to him as legitimate expectations, but he also must have this feeling that these expectations have been blocked. Let us try to understand in some more detail what are these two concepts of legitimate expectations and blocked expectations. First one is legitimate expectation. So, in relative deprivation theory, a person not only desires a given goal, but he also feels that he has a right to obtain that goal. So that he deserves it, or at least under certain conditions, he deserves these goals, he deserves these expectations to be fulfilled. Now, these conditions are termed as, according to Morrison, these conditions are his investments. So, for example, if a student possesses the required qualifications, or if a person possesses required qualifications needed for a specific job, he believes that it is his right, or or the expectation is legitimate to get the job. So that is a legitimate expectation, that is a desire on the part of the individual. If he possesses the required qualifications needed for a particular job, needed for a particular opportunity, it is his legitimate expectation. So, according to Morrison, the idea of legitimate expectation is that the individual think that they deserve something and they have a right to have it. It is their legitimate right to have it. So these expectations are not simple desires, but they are perceived to legitimate as rightful expectations. So the desires of the persons appears to him as legitimate or as rightful expectations. The second is blocked expectations. So relative deprivation also involves the notion that a negative discrepancy between what one legitimately expects, desires, and what one has will generate discontent to the extent that there is a high perceived probability that discriminancy will not be reduced. That is a high probability of blockage. So if expectations that are believed to be legitimate are met, are satisfied, there is a sense of satisfaction among the people. There will no feeling of discontent and deprivation. However, if expectations are not achieved, they experience discontent and frustration. So, if the expectations are perceived as legitimate and there is a blockage in achieving these expectations because of different reasons, it would result into frustration and anger among the people. And in such conditions, people are likely to take certain certain steps to change the situation. So their collective action may take the shape of a social movement. So for social movement to emerge, according to Morrison, there must be a feeling among the individuals or among the collectivity that their desires are legitimate expectation. It is their right. It is their rightful expectation that they must achieve their desires, their goals. And when they realize that these expectations has been blocked, or these expectations are blocked expectations because of different factors. So these two together may result into feeling of discontent and frustration, and the individual and the groups may begin some kind of collective action, collective effort in the form of a social movement. Now, this belief in blockage, when this belief in blockage is translated into a belief in structural blockage. So, when the blockage, when the blockage is translated into that it is a kind of structural blockage, the blockage is not only at the individual level, but it is something which is ingrained in the social structure, which Morrison calls structural blockage. And any attempt at its reduction or solving this structural blockage take the form of a belief in structural solution. So when the expectations are perceived to be blocked, and it is not blocked at the level of individual, but there is the reason for that blockage is structural condition, structural blockage. So the only solution to fulfill their legitimate expectation is to start some kind of structural solution, or to find some structural solution. So therefore, individuals come to see themselves as part of a group with legitimate expectations that are blocked by some aspect of the larger social structure outside the group. So there is an attempt to remove the source of the dissonance by organized group action to change the structural source of that blockage. So, for example, if a person belonging to lower caste comes to realize that his desires are legitimate expectations which must be satisfied, which must be fulfilled, but he also perceives that these expectations has been blocked. and this the major reason for this blockage is the system of caste stratification or caste based society. So it is because of structural blockage that he is not able to satisfy or to fulfill his desires and achieve his goals. So they will organize some kind of they will try to find some structural solution to the structural blockage, and most likely they are to be involved. They will involve in some kind of social movement to basically change that structural blockage or to find a structural solution to that structural blockage. Now, apart from these two concepts, legitimate expectations and blocked expectations, uh, Morrison has also identified certain structural conditions which are important for the emergence of social movement or which play an important role in the emergence of social movement. What are these structural conditions? First is the large population experiencing the relative deprivation. Second, close interaction, communication, and proximity. Third, high role and status commonality. Fourth, a stratification system with clear strata boundaries and visible power differences between the strata. And fifth, the presence of much voluntary association activity in society. So let us just briefly try to understand what are these 5 different structural conditions which play or which may play an important role in the emergence of social movement. So first condition according to Morrison is that a large population experiencing the relative deprivation uh, increases the chances that varying interpretations will be made of any given situation, and particularly that leadership potential will exist among some of those who develop notions of structural blockage and structural solution. So when the feeling of relative deprivation is quite common, or when that relative deprivation is found in a larger population or a larger population experiencing that feeling of relative deprivation, so some kind of leadership will emerge in these groups, which will try to find a structural solution to these structural blockages. Means some kind of social movement is likely to be the result to solve these structural blockages of existing in society. Second is close interaction, communication, and proximity, which are necessary so that similarity of situation or can similarity of situation be better observed, and that can uh, so that interpretations of structural blockage and structural solutions can be reinforced and refined into a coherent ideology when they arise. So uh, it is not only necessary that large population experience relative deprivation there, but there must be a very close interaction and communication between those who are feeling uh, relative deprivation. So for example, if a large population is experiencing relative deprivation but they are not communicated, they are not connected with one another, they are not interacting with one another, social movement is unlikely to emerge. So according to Morrison, the large population must experience relative deprivation, as well as these large population, these people must be communicating, they must be in close communication and interaction with one another, so that they come to realize that there is a need to address that structural blockage, and structural solution can be refined into a kind of ideology which can be used to start some social movement. So these two conditions are necessary. The third structural condition is high role and status commonality. So this high role and status commonality is related to what we popularly call in sociology class consciousness. So those who feel relatively deprived, they must perceive themselves as they share the same role and status in society. So they must develop a feeling of class consciousness. That is basically class consciousness is basically a part of is something which is very important for social movement to emerge. Until as people realize, until unless people develop that group consciousness or class consciousness, the social movements cannot emerge. So it is more difficult to interpret a blockage as due to individual causes when many similar persons experience the same blockage. So this is the third factor this is the third structural condition for the emergence of social movement. Fourth one is a stratification system with clear strata boundaries and visible power differences between the strata. So people must be in a position, or people must perceive that the boundaries, or the society is divided into different strata, different groups, and there is a huge difference, there is a visible difference in terms of power between the different groups. So there is a clear-cut stratification or clearly defined system of stratification in which the different groups are uh, separated from each other, and there is a visible power difference between the strata. So no two strata or two social strata are equal in terms of their access to power or access to any other valuable resources. It may be the social status, or it may be wealth or property in society. So this is another structural conditions which may give rise to some social movement. The last one is presence of voluntary association activity in a society. Now, Morrison believed that this is very important because the notion of a structural solution is unlikely to emerge where there are no precedents or there are no preconditions uh, for the view that society can be changed by voluntary group effort. So the presence of voluntary associations in a society basically gives an opportunity for people to realize that it is possible to change our social condition by organizing into some group. So this presence or the existence of voluntary association activities in a society is much needed, because it will give people a sense of belief, a sense of realization that it is possible to change our situation, and it is by engaging into some kind of social movement or collective effort. So, according to Morrison, for movement to emerge, transfer of faith from individual to group solutions for relative deprivation is must. Now, again, here the explanation of social movement is not socio-psychological, but it is more social in nature. So, for social movement to emerge, it is important, it is necessary that that feeling of relative deprivation must be transferred from individual base to uh, individual solution to group solution. So the feeling of relative deprivation cannot be solved at the individual level. It can only be solved at the group level, or there has to be some group solutions in order to uh, address that feeling of relative deprivation. So this is what Morrison's formulation of concept of relative deprivation is. So these are some of the most important theorists who have contributed in their own ways in developing the concept of relative deprivation, uh, which was very popular in 1950s and 1960s. In 1960s. Now, although this theory of relative deprivation was quite popular in 1950s and 1960s for explaining different kind of political violence and urban disturbances, especially in America. But this theory relative deprivation was criticized on a number of grounds. So the first major criticism against this theory of relative deprivation is that uh, it is not possible that everyone who is feeling relatively deprived will also engage in some kind of conflict or movement. So, according to the theorist of relative deprivation, for a movement to emerge, that feeling of relative deprivation is necessary. But the critics say that that feeling of relative deprivation may be necessary for people to engage in collective movement, but it is not always necessary that everyone who is feeling relatively deprived will also be part or will participate in the conflict or social movement. So Critics of this relative deprivation approach have noted that people don't need to feel deprived to become part of a movement or to participate in a social movement. So this approach, according to the critics, this theory fails to explain why certain feelings of deprivation are transformed into social movements, whereas in similar situations, no collective effort is made to change society or to reorganize society. So, feeling of relative deprivation may be necessary, may be important also, but this theory fails to explain that why in certain in one situation people who feel relative deprived start a movement, and while in other situation people who are feeling relative deprived, they don't take any effort or they don't become part of a movement. So it means that there is something else other than relative deprivation which plays an important role in the emergence of social movement. Second criticism of this theory is that most deprived people, or those who feel deprived, they are unlikely to involve in risky social movement. Now, social movement is something which is highly risky, or which is not something which is very normal process of society, normal procedure of normal process of our social life. So, critics of relative deprivation theory have argued that this theory fails to explain why some people who, though deprived of rights or resources, fail to take part in social movement, which are meant to attain those things. So, according to critics, in reality, very few of the most deprived groups actually engage in protest. As for example, a society's most marginalized people are unlikely, or they are typically not well placed to engage in social movement, which can be a highly risky political action. So, lacking secure economic opportunities and savings, the marginalized section of the society, the most oppressed section of the society, they cannot afford to take any further risks. So, facing discrimination from a more powerful majority, uh, they may seek to remain invisible or to engage in some kind of resistance movement or in some kind of social movement. So, since it is unlikely that those who are feeling relatively deprived, that they will engage into social movement, which is a kind of a risky behavior, or which involves a lot of risks. The third criticism is that this theory by critics is that, according to critics, it is the more integrated rather than the isolated people who are more likely to engage into social conflict. So, critics say that it is not those who are feeling relatively more deprived or isolated who will engage into, or who are more prone to engage into social movement, but comparatively, the more integrated individuals, groups are likely to be involved in some kind of social movement. Again, so it is basically a kind of counter argument to the theory of relative deprivation, which says that those who feel relative deprived, they engage into social movement, but the critic says that no, it is not. It is not those who feel relative deprived, but comparatively the more integrated section, the more integrated members of society who are more likely or more prone to engage in social conflict and social movement. Next criticism is not everyone participate in movement for some benefit. Now, according to relative deprivation theories, those who feel relatively deprived, they engage in movement because they believe that by initiating that social movement, this is the only way by which they can address, by which they can end their condition of relative deprivation, or because of which they are feeling relatively deprived. So critics say that uh, those who participate in a movement, they are not necessarily that they are also feeling relatively deprived. So those who participate in social movement, it is not because that they are feeling relatively deprived, or everyone is feeling relatively deprived and they want to solve certain or they want to achieve some kind of benefit or some kind of personal benefit. So, according to critics, this relative deprivation theory does not account for people, or fail to explain why those people who are not going to directly benefit from the outcome of those movement, why do they participate in social movement? For example, we can take that the example of the animal rights movement, or why straight people support the LGBTQ movement, or why wealthy people support or try to be part of a movement against poverty eradication or income inequality. So, in these cases, participants are believed to act more out of a sense of empathy or sympathy than because of feeling of relative deprivation. So, relative deprivation may be a cause. A majority of people may participate in a movement because all of them feel relative deprived, but it fails to explain that there are many individuals who join a movement although they have never felt of they have never experienced relative deprivation. So this theory fails to explain these conditions. Another criticism is of relative deprivation is that the social movement is the only evidence that people are deprived. So according to critics, relative deprivation does not provide any direct evidence, or it has not produced any direct evidence on the actual feelings of participants prior to their participation. So people are relatively deprived. That can be only sensed, that can be only be realized when people start or when people become part of a movement. So a social movement is the only evidence that people are feeling relatively deprived. So basically this whether people are feeling relatively deprived or not, that can only be realized, or the evidence for that relative deprivation is the movement itself. So according to this explanation, if there is no movement in society, it means that people are not feeling relatively deprived. So this is one of the major loopholes in the theory of relative deprivation, that the movement that it is only by movement that we can provide some evidence that people are feeling relatively deprived. These are some of the references which I have used for this presentation, and those who want to have a much deeper understanding of this theory of relative deprivation, they can go through these readings for further explanation and for further understanding of their subject. Now, to summarize, what we discussed in this lecture is that there are two meanings of the term deprivation. It can be either absolute deprivation as well as relative deprivation. So absolute deprivation is always measured in objective sense. So whereas relative deprivation is more subjective in nature. So for relative deprivation to exist, we make a comparison either with our own past. The individual make their comparison, make a comparative analysis of his or her own condition with his past situation, or with some other external individual or group. Now, although we find some indication of this concept of relative deprivation in the writings of Karl Marx and Alexis de Tocqueville, but for the first time, the most systematic attempt to develop this concept was made by Samuel Stauffer and his associates, who developed a more socio-psychological dimension of relative deprivation in their study titled American Soldier, which was published in 1949. So using this Stauffer's formulation, socio-psychological dimension of relative deprivation, and the earlier theories of frustration aggression model, uh, relative deprivation research in 1960s and further research was made in this relative deprivation theory in the 1960s, and an attempt was made to establish a link between feeling of relative deprivation and social movement. And in this effort, some of the important names include like James Davis, Robert Ted Gore, W.G. Runciman, and there are many more, Denton E. Morrison. And there are many more others who further reworked on this concept of relative deprivation in order to explain collective action and social movement in 1950s and 1960s. So, simply, relative deprivation is a gap between expectations and reality. So, when we expect something and the reality is something else, there is a feeling of relative deprivation. With the beginning of 1970s, different kinds of more refined explanation of theory of more refined explanation of social movement started taking shape. For example, resource mobilization theory, which challenged the theory of relative deprivation for explaining for explaining collective behavior and social movement. So from 1970s onwards, this theory of relative deprivation started declining because it failed to answer some of the major criticism labeled against it by the critics at that time. Just to conclude, we can say that despite its criticism and many shortcomings, the concept of relative deprivation offers social scientists to explain some of the fundamental questions of collective action. Relative deprivation theory suggests that people who feel they are being deprived of something considered essential in their society. It can be wealth, it can be social and political rights. They will organize or join social movement dedicated to obtaining the things of which they feel deprived. So in some cases, relative deprivation has been cited as a factor driving incidents of social disorder like rioting and looting and civil wars also. So in this way, social movement and their associated disorderly acts can often be attributed to the grievances of people who feel they are denied resources to which they are entitled. So friends, this was the second lecture on the topic relative deprivation from the second module of the paper Social Movement. The second module is titled Theories of Social Movement. This video lecture was recorded by me at home during the national lockdown period for COVID-19 pandemic using minimal technical resources. Technical errors, if any, are unintentional and may please be ignored. Thank you very much.